Okay.
So we are live now on YouTube at the YouTube channel of Istanbul Ticaret University. So let me start the meeting. First of all, on behalf of Istanbul Ticaret University Finance and Banking Department, we'd like to welcome you all. Thank you very much for your attendance to our lecture series, Istanbul Ticaret University Finance and Banking Department Seminar Series, to promote the development of high-quality research that extends the frontier of financial knowledge. As you know, we recently initiated this seminar series, started last month, and our aim is to make contribution to the development and dissemination of knowledge about academic finance, as well as to the development and our understanding of basic and applied research and of sound financial practices. And of course, to enhance the quality of education and research in finance by providing this scholarly platform for empirical financial studies and by connecting the academicians, students, and professionals. Today, we are honored to host, we're truly honored and excited by hosting Professor George Constantinides'i, one of the most senior and prominent faculties of the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I knew him for 20 years almost during the time I visited University of Chicago Graduate School of Business. That time, that was the name of the school within my postdoc study. And thankfully, George Constantinides'i also showed his professionalism and support in many ways to me personally, and I at the first hand witnessed the high quality research and education in finance at the University of Chicago Graduate School of Business that time. It's hard to believe, but George has been serving in University of Chicago, if it is not a typo, since 1979. 1979. So
now I'm the second most senior member in our group after Jean Fama.
Jean Fama, that's what I was going to say, George. I was not sure about that, but that's what I was guessing. To be honest, yes, definitely. It's so almost approaching to the 50 year in the, the University of Chicago is the University of the Nobel laureates, Nobel Prize winners. And most of the Nobel Prize prizes went to the University of, in economics especially, went to the University of Chicago graduates or faculty. George is, he's, of course, I'm not sure, I don't want to maybe read all your resume. That will take quite a long time based on your seniority and large number of papers, research, and contribution to the academic finance. But at least, I mean, I'd like to say George Constantinides'i served also as a president of the American Finance Association and of the Society for Financial Studies. And he's also research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, the leading research organization, non-governmental research organization in US. And he serves as director and trustee of the Dimensional Fund Advisors family of funds and trusts. He earned his bachelor's degree from Oxford University and MBA and DBA degrees from the Indiana University. He joined Chicago Booth in 1979 and also previously taught at Carnegie Mellon University. He also visited Harvard University as a Marvin Bower Fellow. His research interest including portfolio management, asset pricing, derivatives pricing, capital markets, and he extensively published in most prestigious journals, and he's still active in the last 5 years or so. He also made publications in Journal of Finance, a review of asset pricing studies, and other leading journals in academic finance. Today, he will be talking about the sentiment, productivity, and economic research based on his joint research with his co-authors. And a very interesting research with the behavioral aspects to the big questions, questions at the related with the economy, economic growth. We find it very interesting and very much looking forward to listening the research and the insights of Professor George Constantinides. So thank you very much for your attendance to our seminar. And I'd like to give the floor to the Professor Constantinides.
Thank you, Richard. I would like to thank all of you for participating at this meeting. I would like to start by expressing my very deep and sincere sympathies to the families of the victims of the disaster that visited Turkey recently. It was a terrible event, and he was deeply moved by it. Now to the presentation. Please interrupt at any moment. I would like to very much look forward to have your feedback and learn something from this as much as I hope you learned from this. So this paper, which is kind of different than what I did before, where I sort of, in my earlier research, I was strictly rational expectations. Everybody was rational. And then here I visit sentiment, which has an irrational component. So this is kind of new research for me, and I find it very exciting. So this paper is joined with Mauricio Montone from University of Utrecht, Valerio Podi from University College Dublin, and Stella Spigliotti from the University of Athens. So, okay. So here we have expectations, and the effect of expectations on the economy have occupied economists for a very long time. And going back to Pigou, 1927, talked about expectations and sentiment, and argued that it reflects businessmen's beliefs, which means that it is grounded on the macroeconomy. And then by contrast, we have Keynes in 1936, which sort of introduced the term animal spirits, so that expectations and sentiment is not grounded on anything. Could it be possible that they're both right? And we'll argue that they're both right. It's just that in the practically all of the research until now on sentiment, people do not distinguish two things that are different. One is the rational component of sentiment, and the other is the irrational, the behavior, what we'll be referring to is the animal spirits. Most of the earlier research put together those two components of sentiment. And part of our task is to, and what is original here, is to split sentiment to its rational and its animal spirits component and see the effect of these two different components on the macroeconomy and specifically on economic growth. So here are three different types of research referring to sentiment. And now that I sensitized you to the idea that we have two different types of sentiment, the rational and the animal spirits component, you will see that this research does not distinguish between the two. And although these three schools of thought about sentiment seem to be opposing each other, once we split it down to its components, the rational and the animal spirits, you see that there's no conflict between them. So let's take the first one that says that sentiment reflects positive signals or news over future fundamentals. Yes, the rational component is grounded on fundamentals, and fundamentals forecast future fundamentals. So there is some truth to it. But in which countries? And here I'm introducing a second very important concept and contribution of this paper, that the effect of the rational component and the animal spirits component can be different in different countries based on the economic development and the development of the financial markets in these countries. So sentiment, again, in the first group, reflects a positive signal over future fundamentals. This is the rational component. And of course, the fundamentals anticipate or cause future fundamentals. So that's consistent with that view. And now, whether they cause it, that's something that we'll examine. And whether fundamentals cause future growth depends on whether it stimulates investment, and we'll again analyze this channel, to what extent these signals stimulate investment. The second group says that sentiment has no relation with fundamentals. That's Keynes' view. So it is the irrational component of sentiment. So it only generates short-lived economic fluctuations. And yes, there is truth to that. For advanced economies where the markets are sort of clear, so that we find that this component does not influence the economy in advanced economies, and it has only a short-lived effect. But by contrast, we'll also see that in less advanced economies, this animal spirits component of sentiment has a big influence on the economies of less advanced economies. Now, going to the third component, so it says that sentiment exerts an immediate and lasting effect on economic growth through self-fulfilling big feedback loop. That's not important in advanced economies where sentiment, the animal spirits component of the sentiment, has a short-lived effect on the economy in advanced economies, but has a lasting effect on less advanced economies. So all these statements that sort of seem to be contradictory become clear and, in fact, non-contradictory when we do the two things that we try to do in this paper. First, distinguish between the two components of the sentiment, the rational and the animal spirits, the rational component. And second, look at the effect of these components in a cross-section of countries. And the effect is different in different countries. Let me pause here and again encourage you, if you have any questions, clarifying questions, or any comments, please bring them forth. Here are no questions. Okay. Yes, please.
We haven't received yet, George, but definitely I will submit it to you.
Okay, great. So, our idea is at the bottom of the slide is to test the model across countries. So the intuition, which I already talked about, is we find it hard advanced economies that people receive a lot of reliable information from the financial markets, then investors can distinguish between the rational and the psychological effect of sentiment. But in less advanced economies, we find that it is harder to distinguish. And therefore, these pure psychological mood swings can, and we document that do have an effect on the economy through investment. Okay. So how we identify sentiment shocks, and we built on earlier research, and these are productivity shocks and long-run economic news. By the way, you can see from the bottom of my slides that there are 78 slides, and of course in 40 minutes, I will not be able to cover all of it. So I'll cover what is the main message of the paper, and I'll briefly allude to the other, what is the rest of the paper. I also made available to you, or if you don't have it, please send me an email and I'll send you the full-fledged paper to read it in detail if you so wish. So the main findings are that in the G7 countries, by the way, I talked about advanced economies and less advanced economies. And there are sort of different ways of distinguish between these. We have a time series of the sentiment for 16 countries. So of this, we do two things. We look at the group of the G7 countries, which are what we call the advanced economies, and the remaining 9 countries, which are the non-G7 countries and the less advanced economies. You may argue that this is a fairly arbitrary way of grouping countries into advanced and less advanced. So we group them in different ways that I'll refer to later on. But for most of the presentation, I'll refer to them as the G7 countries as being the more advanced economies, and the non-G7 countries as being the less advanced economies. So for the G7 countries, we find that the sentiment, the animal spirits component of the sentiment has a small and very short-lived effect on economic growth, and has no effect on future productivity, which is consistent in one of the views put forth earlier. By contrast, in the non-G7 countries, the animal spirits sort of has an effect on economic growth, because in these countries, it is harder to rely on the economic data produced by these countries, and investors confuse the fundamental and the irrational component of the sentiment, so they cannot split them apart easily. So in these non-G7 countries, sentiment substantially increases economic growth, and that's a lasting effect. We look at economic growth 1, 2, 3, and 4 years ahead, and it has an effect on economic growth up to 4 years ahead. And that increases future productivity, and that sort of affects the economy. So even the component that is not grounded in fundamentals has a big effect on the non-G7 countries. So again, to go deeper into these two components of sentiment, we find that the mispricing correction through the actions, investment in the country, and also through the stock market is short-lived. there is an effect even in advanced economies, but it is short-lived because investors can quickly separate out the component of the sentiment based on fundamentals and the component of sentiment, which is animal spirits. But not so in the less advanced economies. And managerial market timing, so in sentiment predicts in advanced economies a short-term increase in capital investment, but it's only short-lived in advanced economies, but the effect is stronger and lasts longer in non-G7 countries. Okay. Now, the second contribution of the paper then is to look across different countries, and I mentioned across these 16 different countries. The most of the research looks at one country, and typically, as most of the research is based on the US, which of course is an advanced economy. So, and by contrast, we look at different countries and we see the very different effect. One exception was one study that looked at the sentiment in different states within the United States, but that's not much variation. So looking across different countries with very different economic development and capital markets allows us to provide much stronger results. So the previous research shows that the effect of sentiment, and by that I mean the behavioral component of the sentiment, is temporary and small, but that was done in the US. By contrast, we show that sentiment can create economic boost as predicted by theory in less advanced economies. So the key difference is that we exploit cross-country variation in sentiment and market efficiency rather than focus on a single country or states within the United States. So the channel through which that happens is that sentiment leads to make it easier to raise capital. High sentiment makes it easier to raise capital and investment. And also the sentiment, by doing that, markets become better informed. So we show that sentiment affects growth through both mechanisms, by providing better information and by make it easier for firms to raise capital and invest. So the methodology is we sort of will distinguish in our regressions between the agents, are the households, and also the investors. We do not distinguish between them. And our data or sentiment comes from surveys. And this is data is provided, the country-specific consumer confidence index is provided by the OECD, so it is measured in the same way. It is a uniform index across these 16 countries. So this index is widely used as a proxy for biases, and much previous research relied on this index. The main hurdle is to distinguish sentiment from news, and to this end, we'll see that later. Particularly for smaller countries, they are affected by sentiment not only in their own country, we see, but also by the global sentiment. As we all know, when the United States sneezes, the whole world catches cold because the US economy is so dominant, and through trade, it affects the economies of many different countries. So when you look at the less advanced economies, we look both at the effect of sentiment within their own country and also with a global measure of sentiment. So to repeat, we have 16 OECD countries, and the study covers 1975 to 2019, and of course we hope to extend it to the more as close to the present year. So here is sort of our basic decomposition. So equation 1 looks at the sentiment of a country. C stands for the subscript for a country. You want to decompose it to the two components, the explain component, which is based on fundamentals at that point in time in the country, and the second component, which is orthogonal to it and correlated to it, which is the pure sentiment. So we have these two components. So how do we separate out the two components? Think of equation 2 as a time series for one country. On the left-hand side is the sentiment of that country at time t, and we trace that against three measures of fundamentals of that country at that point in time. The first one is the real GDP growth, contemporaneous. The second is real consumption growth, and the third component is employment growth. So think of running that regression at one country at a time. But we can gain more power in our regressions by combining these regressions across the different countries. So we do a panel regression. Okay? But for simplicity, you can think of it as we are doing a regression for each country separately. But for more statistical power, we combine them in this panel regression. And when you do a panel regression, of course, you have to have fixed effects, this A subscript C for each one, a different one for each country. So based on that, then we have can identify the explained sentiment, the sentiment based on fundamentals, and its orthogonal component, which is based on pure animal spirits. To go back one slide, then the fitted value, which is then the value that includes the terms, the fixed effects, and these regressions up to there, but not including the error term. That is the fundamental component. And this, which by the error term, which by construction is uncorrelated with the fundamentals, is the unexplained component of the sentiment, which is the animal spirits component. So this is what I state in the next one. So the explained component of the sentiment is the fitted value, and the difference, the error term, is the orthogonalized sentiment, which is the animal spirits. This is important because this is the foundation of what you do. So you can stop here and see if you have any questions. I hear no questions. All right. So now that for each country, we split the sentiment into two components, the fundamental and the animal spirits component. And we see that these components have different effects on the economy. So now we also look at the price dividend ratio of each country. And this is the country-wide, not firm specific, country-wide price dividend ratio, which in earlier research, we know that it forecasts economic growth and returns and lots of other things. So we want to split that also into the pure sentiment, the first component, the pure sentiment, and the one based on fundamentals. And how do we do that? Going to the next slide, we do a regression. Again, think of it as a country by country time series regression. The left-hand side is the total sentiment, so total price dividend ratio, and we regress it on the pure sentiment component of the sentiment, the animal spirits. Then the first three terms of this regression will give us the component of the price dividend ratio, which is based on animal spirits, ungrounded behavior, and the remaining then is going to be the component of the price dividend ratio, which is based on fundamentals. Okay, now that's what we say here. The sentiment component is the fitted value from that regression, and the fundamental component is the difference, where this difference is the residual in our time series regression. And there is an alternative decomposition which amounts to the same thing. So in testing the equation, we also do this, but for purposes of this presentation, I'm going to skip that. But it is an alternative way of combining those terms of the two components of the price dividend ratio. All right, so here is equation 10 is, okay. So we are going to, let me skip that as well. Productivity, okay, that's the most important one. And this regression, these results in this table is tell us the whole story. So this slide gives us the productivity 1 year ahead. T+1 means 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, and the following slide looks at 3 and 4 years ahead. So I'll be going back and forth between these two slides. So having split the productivity in its two components, let's look at the first column. Gives us the full 16 countries, but we focus on the next column, which is the G7 and the non-G7. We see very different results. So in our regression, the productivity 1 year ahead is greatly affected, is forecasted, whether that's causal or not, we have discussed here, but is forecasted by the productivity component of the price dividend ratio, which is based on fundamentals. So this is statistically significant marginally, but is more significant, that's column 5, in 2 years ahead. And going to the next slide, you see it's also very, very significant in 3 years ahead and 4 years ahead. So the first conclusion is that the fundamental component of the productivity forecasts in a very unambiguous and strong way the productivity of advanced economies, the G7 economies, 1, 2, 3, and 4 years ahead. By contrast, the fundamental component of the price dividend ratio does not forecast the productivity of the non-G7 countries. You see the coefficient, regression coefficient is tiny and is not statistically significant. 1 year, 2 years, and the next slide you see 3 and 4 years ahead. So the conclusion is that the fundamental component of the price dividend ratio forecasts very strongly and very unambiguously productivity growth 1, 2, 3, and 4 years ahead, but none in non-G7 countries. Now, the contrast is the sentiment component of the price dividend ratio, which you see in the G7 countries, it does not affect, does not forecast productivity 1 year, 2 years, up to 4 years ahead. Why? Because in the advanced economies, there is a lot of information coming from the advanced financial markets, and the data is more reliable, so people can distinguish between the component of the price dividend ratio based on fundamentals and the pure sentiment component. By contrast, you see that the sentiment component of the price dividend ratio has a very, very significant effect on the productivity growth in the non-G7 countries. You see that for 1 year, 2 years, and in the next slide, you see it for 3, 4 years ahead. So that's a big contrast. In non-G7 countries, it is hard to distinguish, and there are 2 reasons. First, it's hard to distinguish between the 2 components of the price dividend ratio, and the sentiment component then is mistaken as important component, and it affects the productivity in the non-G7 countries up to 4 years ahead. And the second reason is that, as you shall see later, that in these smaller countries, they are affected through international trade by the sentiment, the worldwide sentiment, not just their country-specific sentiment. So if you are to take one conclusion, this table, for 1 and 2 years ahead, and the next one 3 and 4 years ahead, so that is the most important message in the paper, without yet analyzing the channel of this. But to summarize that, I think I have a here is a summary then of that important table, that in G7 countries, future productivity is explained by fundamentals. The effect is stable over time, and it forecasts productivity as far as 4 years ahead. It could be longer than that, but we look only at 4 years ahead. And in non-G7 countries, you see that the sentiment based on fundamentals has no effect on the future productivity of this country in up to 4 years ahead, but the effect is explained by sentiment in the non-G7 countries. And the effect is important to 4 years, is very important in the first year, but it becomes less important. Okay. So what is the reason that for non-G7 countries, the fundamentals play no role? And that's what I already alluded to, that the economic growth is affected through international trade by the international sentiment and international price dividend ratio. And then we ask the question, might it be that the fundamentals on the G7 countries, and in particular the US, affect the non-G7 productivity? We investigate that, and I'm not going to show the results, but yes, that seems to be the case. So although the fundamental component of the price dividend ratio of a country does not affect or does not forecast its future productivity, the international component does. But again, despite that, when you have in the regression the international component of the price dividend ratio, in these non-G7 countries, their future productivity is also very strongly affected by their sentiment, the sentiment component of their price dividend ratio. So we do a horse race and we find that, which I'm not going to discuss. Now, as I said, I'm a little uneasy about a measure, a heavy-handed measure of combining the countries into two groups, the advanced ones based on being the G7 countries and the other ones. There is, even within the G7 countries, there is a lot of heterogeneity amongst countries, and also among the non-G7 countries, there is a lot of heterogeneity among those countries. So we also look at different measures of defining advanced versus less advanced economies, and two measures that have been suggested in the literature by Rajan and Zigalis are stock turnover over GDP. So the higher the turnover, the more advanced the capital markets, and also the GDP per capita. That's the second measure. So essentially repeat a previous estimation based on the basic table that I showed you, and we find that these measures are also tell the same story. So we have three then different ways of classifying countries in terms of economic development. The one that for which I showed the table, membership to G7 versus non-membership to G7, but also this stock turnover over GDP and the GDP per capita, and you get very similar results, which are all presented in the paper, but I'm not going to, here are the results, but I'm not going to result. Also, whether they're members of the European Monetary Union or not, that's another measure. So again, I'm skipping these results. So economic growth. So we are beginning to look at how does sentiment and price dividend ratios, components of the sentiment affect economic growth. And sort of look at consumption. The results are not very interesting for consumption, so I'm going to skip. But employment growth, and we find that the first channel of sort of high fundamental sentiment is important for G7 countries. Employment growth 1, 2, and 3 years ahead, and also for non-G7 countries. So that is not sort of distinguished. But also GDP growth, we find that for GDP growth, okay, that's important. So let's look at the component of the price dividend ratio based on fundamentals. For G7 countries, it plays no role, because in G7 countries, GDP growth is based on fundamentals. So it's not important. It is important for the sentiment shock. It's important for 1 year ahead for GDP growth because it stimulates growth, but the effect is short term. It's only 1 year. It does not affect the 2 years, 3 and 4 years ahead. Why in the non-G7 countries, the sentiment component of the price dividend ratio has affects GDP growth 1, 2, 3, up to 4 years ahead. Okay, that's the results. So to summarize that, so the sentiment shocks predict in the G7 countries small and short-lived economic growth. In non-G7 countries have a large and lasting economic growth lasting up to 4 years. So what is the channel for this? Okay, and this is the last thing I'm going to discuss. And the channel is basically investment. First of all, why does the sentiment component have a short-term effect on the advanced economies and the longer effect in the less advanced economies? We can also see that through the sentiment component of the price-dividend ratio forecasting returns. And here is what we find through the forecasting regressions, which I only summarize here. I will not go through the table. Basically, the sentiment is a negative predictor of returns in advanced economies, which says that even in the short term, in advanced economies, people realize that the stock prices are irrationally elevated, so they are going to adjust, and they adjust soon. So even in 1 year ahead, we forecast that in these countries, the returns are going to correct, and in fact, they do. So you see that in these efficient markets, the mispricing correction is fast, and therefore the high sentiment forecasts negative returns for the advanced economies. By contrast, in the less advanced economies, the correction does not happen quickly, so it forecasts a positive return. Okay, so this here show how the two components of the sentiment can fool the economies in less advanced economies, but not only temporarily for the advanced economies. So these are the tables which I'm going to skip. So round up the following high sentiment, the mispricing correction is fast in the G7 countries because the arbitrage forces work fast, and the mispricing is corrected within a year, and that's consistent with earlier research, but is slow in the non-G7. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Okay, and that's what I have to say. So let me, keeping in time of about 40 minutes presentation, let me give the concluding remarks, and if you have comments, you can revisit any of the results that I covered or some of the results that I did not cover. So conclusion. So previous literature has proposed three competing views of the relation between sentiment and growth, and both can be partly cohesive. Sentiment reflects positive news over future fundamentals, so it anticipates growth, or sentiment is unrelated to fundamentals, so it only generates short-lived economic fluctuations. And the other line of thought is that sentiment exerts an immediate and lasting effect on economic growth. And we see that all of them are partly correct, but in specific circumstances. And they're partly correct if we, as we do, separate out sentiment in its rational component based on fundamentals, and the component that is pure sentiment or animal spirits. And also the effect of the two components is different in different countries based on the degree of their economic development. So in this paper, we tackle the stories exploiting cross-country variation in sentiment and market efficiency. So that's the basic message of the paper. So all these stories are partly true, but people did not take the studies deeper to separate out the two components of the sentiment, and they also focus their studies in the US without distinguish between markets which are more or less advanced. The second takeaway is that for G7 countries, you find that sentiment, the irrational, by that I mean the animal spirits component of the sentiments, creates overpricing, but it is followed by quick, fast correction. because of stronger arbitrage forces. Now, in these countries, overpricing spurs higher aggregate investment, but again, this is short-term and consistent in the literature. However, sentiment has no effect on future productivity. It's higher investment, but because the investors' firms are full in the short run, but it does not affect future productivity. It has no permanent. By contrast, in the non-G7 countries, we find that high sentiment has slow correction because of weaker arbitrage forces, and up to 4 years it has an effect because investors cannot easily disentangle the sentiment based on fundamentals and the pure sentiment, the animal spirit. So the unrecognized sentiment spurs a larger economic growth, and this is a lasting effect because up to 4 years, firms have difficulty recognizing that this animal spirits component of the sentiment should not have an effect on the economy, but they are fooled by it, so the investment is higher up to 4 years ahead. And as a result of this country, the higher investment causes higher future productivity, which is some of the earlier researchers I said, is it possible that sentiment causes larger economic growth and that affects higher future productivity? So endogenous higher future productivity, and the answer is yes, but in the less advanced economies. So this is the first paper to find evidence for these mechanisms, and under what circumstances, which is the less advanced economies, but not in the endogenous growth, but not in the advanced economy. And that's a summary of what I have to say. So I thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, and if we have time, I'll be very happy to address them.
Dear Professor Constantinides, thank you very much for your great presentation. I personally love the idea, this great idea, great execution, based on a novel approach and methodology you used, actually based on a basic idea and the theoretical model of Ben Habib. I think you very eloquently make this distinction and show the differences, the effects of the cross-sectional sentiment differences on the economic growth and productivity. I have just quick questions on my mind, very basic. First of all, based on in your data, you compare the G7 and non-G7 countries, but still OECD countries, 16 countries. I'm not sure if, for example, Turkey is included to this OECD countries, as I haven't seen the name of the countries in your paper, but they may not necessarily be.
We list all the countries in a footnote.
In the footnote. Okay, I missed that. Sorry. And these non-G7 countries, 16 OECD countries, may not be very small and less developed economies. Of course, comparing to G7, yes, but can you expand your data set? I mean, to make the results, especially to confirm and strengthen your innovative outcome of this research paper, especially for non-G7 countries, predicting sentiment, predicting the sentiment shocks, predicting the future productivity, while widening your data set by including even less developed countries and the financial markets beyond these 16 countries, or even going out of the OECD, for example, if the data is available. Of course, between 79 and 2016 or 17, I'm not sure if the data is available for such countries. For example, the stock exchange first was established in Turkey in 1986, so it's hard to, it may be hard to find the data.
Okay. Okay.
Just to make your results maybe more visible, more concrete, by also showing the difference, we expect the even stronger results for the even less developed countries because of this, inefficiency of the market.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Richard. As you foresaw, it's important to have a uniform index of sentiment, and we have these countries because they do have the OECD provided index of sentiments, which is computed in the same way. In fact, based on consumer, not producer information. So the limiting to these 16 countries was necessitated by the data, but that's a good suggestion. We'll see whether we can extend it to beyond that. And something related to what you said, of course, even within these 16 countries, there is a lot of heterogeneity. Even within the G7, there are big and bigger countries, and even the non-OECD, there are medium and smaller countries. So we felt uneasy about that. We present the results in terms of this by model classification, G7 and non-G7, but also, as I pointed out in the scroll back, we also look at different measures of economic development, okay? Not separating them by G7 and non-G7. Somewhere here, if I can find it. Oh, yeah. Okay, here we are. All right. Here is financial development measure based on, as I said, based on other measures in the literature. And you use the two by Rajan and Zigalis, and they have other measures, but you choose these two because these measures, you have most of the observations. So stock turnover over GDP is a measure of development. So let's look at the results. So here is the result. We address that by having a cross term. We have the sentiment component, but multiplied by a measure of financial development. And essentially, you see that the coefficient 1, 2, 3, and 4 years ahead is negative and statistically significant. What does this mean? That the higher the economic development of that country, according to this measure, then the lower the effect of the sentiment component of the price dividend ratio. Okay. Yeah. Or to put it more strongly, to just look at the reverse. For countries with low financial development, then the effect is stronger. Yeah. So that's the first measure, and the second table is the second measure, which gives us essentially the same results. Yeah. So, but it's useful to think if we can push the boundary and introduce other expanded set of 16 countries, but that a key constraint for that is whether we can have the sentiment index provided by these additional countries using the same methodology.
Thank you very much, George. Actually, at this point, to measure the level of financial development, of course, we rely on the study of Rajan and his co-author. But I would expect, I mean, instead of using the turnover, to GDP, market cap to GDP, which is, I mean, more widely used indicator of the financial development.
Sorry, which one? Which one?
Market capitalization to GDP. Market, instead of trading turnover,
Yeah.
market cap to GDP. For example, if you,
Yeah, this is very important.
yeah, think about Turkey. The Turkish market is one of the turnover ratio, for example, in Turkey, one of the highest in the world. I mean, always in top 3 in the world, turnover ratio at the exchange. Last year it was number 1. So very speculative, very short-term trading dominating the trading volume. So if you rank the countries, I believe turnover to GDP, maybe Turkey is one of the highest, but I'm not sure if your story fits to Turkey. Individually. So that's why maybe our market cap might be better represented. But these are very minor,
that's very important. That's very important, and it's easy to do. So
correct.
In fact,
And also, George, I have a minor couple of things, if you have time, just
Sure.
to add at this point. Alternative measures for sentiment. For example, you use the consumer index. For example, how about the PMI? Or you cited in your paper the Baker-Regler, they were using to measure the sentiment, the closed-end fund premium. So such alternative measures, I'm not sure if can be used robustness purposes, for example, in your paper. And also one more thing regarding the PD, price dividend ratio. I know this is, of course, a very important indicator in the literature, widely accepted. But for example, in Turkey, again, referring to individual one country, PD ratio in Turkey, it's usually not very much considered by the investment community unless it's unless it's outlier. I mean, if it's too high unless it's too high from the market average, usually it's very stable and relatively small number. Comparing, especially if you compare with the high interest rates in the country.
Yes.
So usually markets not much care for the PD ratio and not use it as an indicator. I mean, especially for the shocks.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, and in fact, now we I step back and look again at the paper, and the preoccupation of the price dividend ratio is because a lot of the earlier research looks at the price dividend ratio, and the earlier research decomposes the price dividend ratio to the rational and irrational component by doing what we did on the sentiment, basically by decreasing the price dividend ratio and fundamentals. And the fitted component then is the fundamental component of the price dividend ratio, and the residual is the non-fundamental component. And I step back and we're in the process of revising the paper and say, why even introduce a price dividend ratio? Since we have the sentiment and we already decomposed the sentiment into its components, do the regressions directly, leave out the price dividend ratio and look at the regressions of the future productivity based having on the right-hand side the two components of the sentiment and see the effect of that. So we are pursuing those kind of regressions now, and I think we'll make the paper even more strikingly independent of the earlier research by even, I think it's useful to present the results of the price dividend ratio, but that should be secondary. The primary one is look at the effect directly of the two components of the sentiment, the fundamental and the non-fundamental. Yeah, so that would be consistent with what you suggest, that we see what happens if we take a step back from the price dividend ratio, which is, as you said, that in Turkey and perhaps in other countries, the people don't look too much at the price dividend ratio unless it is way out of the normal range.
Thank you, George. Just what I thought, I mean, when in one of your slides you mentioned about fast correction, especially in the developed markets, in more efficient markets. Do you think can be related with the existence or the share of the HFT traders in the market? The higher the HFT traders, the faster the correction.
We could, of course, this everything is at the annual basis, so you would not be capturing that directly. But I don't know what data we have about the percentage. I mean, I know that in the US, high-frequency traders account for about half of all the trades. I don't know if we can get the corresponding results for all the other countries. Yeah, that's another measure of economic activity and advanced markets. Yeah,
George, thank you. Very last two questions from the audience. One is from the Professor Chankaya. The effect of sentiment would be more significant, is a question mark. So I'm expecting the effect of sentiment more significant in your results. And another question is, what would you recommend to those who want to work on this topic? Any recommendations about further research?
Okay. Well, first of all, let's take the first question. I did not quite understand what is the effect of sentiment. What was it?
The effect of sentiment is, I think he meant should be more significant.
Well, we see that it is very, very significant for the less advanced economies. But you say it should be more significant also in the advanced economies. It fools investors in the advanced economies, but for a short period. That's the result.
Oh, sorry, I misunderstood the question. It's a comment, not a question. So it's okay. It's fine. Yeah.
The second one, what do I recommend? Well, that's a very, the answer can be very tricky, because if there is a direct answer, oh yeah, you can do this and that, then since we sort of be familiar with the data and we work them, if there is something simple that I could recommend, I would have done it in this paper myself. So, but I think you gave us a lot of suggestions that one can build on this, and to summarize them, which are very important for the benefit of those who want to expand on that, is another measure of economic development, market cap over GDP. Now that I think of it, it's a very obvious one, and that's something one can do. And then the presence of the closed-end funds. Of course, I think the closed-end funds sort of have been superseded nowadays by the ETFs. So maybe there's an effect of that. ETFs is closed-end funds with a quick correction. So that probably has affected, I haven't looked at it, the discounts and premiums of closed-end funds. So it may contaminate that measure of the closed, which was a big puzzle for many years, and now the ETFs with the authorized participants quickly move in and eliminate them. And the high frequency traders is important. And But something that relates to that is also here we are looking at the general economic state of the economy. So we look at a year, 1 year to 4 years. And one could do a study along these lines at a higher frequency. Maybe not the frequency of the high frequency traders, but the effect of sentiment in high frequency data. Of course, the returns are available at the high frequency, but many of the economic measures do not change. Employment does not change from day to day. So it's not clear in my mind, which is good. If it's not clear in my mind, it means I'm not going to jump in and do it in the next regression in the next hour. But someone to think about these effects at a higher frequency, I think that will be very interesting. And of course, although we do not have some aggregate economic measures at a daily basis changing, we can do it at a frequency that is available, but more frequent than annual. So that would be an interesting pursuit. But more generally, people should think about the two things that we sort of promote, and there is much more to be done, sort of splitting the sentiment itself in its two components. That's a big step forward, I think, and looking cross-sectional.
Exactly, this is the critical point in the model. Definitely, it's a big question. Okay, thank you very much, George, for also sharing your comments and suggestions for further research. We do appreciate, and on behalf of Istanbul Ticaret University Finance and Banking Department, also we very much appreciate and thankful to you for the support to the Finance and Banking Seminar Series of Istanbul Ticaret University by being a part of this. And was a great presentation, great paper. Thank you once again for your participation and your support. We appreciate, and looking forward to seeing you in Turkey soon.
Forward to that, and thank you again for your attention and for the comments. That I'm going to look into that, and if any people have any further thoughts after, did you make the paper available to them, or if them is not, they send me an email and I can send you the paper. And any further comments and two-way discussion is. And now with Zoom, we can collaborate very easily. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
So this is the end of our session. Thank you very much for your participation, all attendees. Hope to see you in our next seminar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.